Start off doing our 17 periods of Bible history. Going to do this twice at the beginning of class. The first time, though, what I'm going to do right now is we're going to go through the periods, and then I'm going to kind of quiz you guys on what links the period that we are on with the period that we are going to. And so, if you haven't been here for the last couple of classes, it might be confusing. You might not know it, but we'll work through it. All right, what's the first period? Before the flood, right? Before the flood. And what links before the flood with the next period? Noah, that's right. I think more specifically, if we're talking about a period before the flood, then after that should probably be the flood, right? And then you have the flood. The flood, what links it with the next period? So the next one is scattering of the people. But how do we get from the flood to the scattering of the people? The Tower of Babel, that's right. So, you remember the place where Noah and his family landed? Mount Ararat, right? They landed Mount Ararat. They went down into the plain of Shinar, a region of Mesopotamia. And then they built up again to the Tower of Babel, right? And then it was the Tower of Babel where you had the scattering of the peoples. Scattering of the peoples. And what's after scattering of the people? The patriarchs. How do we get from scattering of the people to the patriarchs? So Genesis 12, God calls Abram, and Abram is a descendant of Noah's son, Shem, right? And Shem's family, after the scattering of the people, remains somewhere around the region of Mesopotamia, right? But then Abram's father Terah journeyed to the land of Haran, and then Abram is called. And what's after the period of the patriarchs? The Exodus. So this is probably one of the biggest leaps in time that we have, right? Where we go from, who are the patriarchs, by the way? Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We go from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to, 500,000 people, over 500,000 people leaving Egypt, right? What links these two periods together? How do we get from patriarchs to? The story of Joseph, right? Yeah. The end of the story of Joseph leaves Israel and his children going into the land of Egypt because of a famine, right? And they stay there for like 430 years until they're eventually leaving Egypt. And what's after Exodus from Egypt? The wandering in the wilderness, right? This one's a little bit easier because, what's the connection between leaving Egypt and wandering in the wilderness? If they're leaving somewhere, they have to go into somewhere else, right? Which is the wilderness. And it's at Kadesh Barnea where they sin against God, they rebel, and then God says, therefore, you are going to wander till that generation dies out. So, after the wandering in the wilderness, what do we get? The invasion and conquest of Canaan, right? What links the wandering in the wilderness to the invasion and conquest of Canaan?
The 12 spies.
What's that?
The 12 spies when they go in and they look.
That probably is between the Exodus from Egypt and the wandering in the wilderness. I'm thinking more specifically, we probably are looking at the death of Moses and the handing over to Joshua of leadership. That takes place at the end of Deuteronomy. And so it's Joshua who God chooses to lead his people into Canaan and to clear out the people who are living in Canaan, right? And what comes after conquest of Canaan? The judges. Yeah. Once they enter into Canaan, once they clear it out, what happens to them? Into the land, it seems like, and they started worshiping idols like the people around them. And then God gave them into the hands of their enemies, right? And that caused Israel to cry out to God, to somewhat repent. And then God gives them a deliverer, which is a judge. Think about a judge like a fighter more often than not. Not like a judge in our court systems where they just kind of preside over cases. No, a judge in biblical times was somebody who killed people. After the judges, what comes next? The United Kingdom. What's the connection or link between judges and the United Kingdom? Okay, yeah. So we have the last judge. What's his name? Samuel. Yeah, the last judge is Samuel. And where do we get the stories of Saul and David? What book of the Bible do we find those in? 1 Samuel. Yeah. So in the days of Samuel, the people cry out and they're asking for a king. Yeah, give us a king. And it's Samuel who anoints Saul and then later on David, which leads us into the United Kingdom. So there are no more judges to deliver Israel or to lead Israel. Instead, God uses kings from then on. So after United Kingdom, what comes next? Divided kingdom. It doesn't stay united for long, does it? What's the link between United Kingdom and divided kingdom? There are 3 kings in the United Kingdom. What are their names? Saul, David, and Solomon. But the United Kingdom ended with Solomon, right? It ended with Solomon. Solomon did some very bad things at the end of his life. And because of that, God, in the days of Solomon's son, who was even worse than Solomon, ended up ripping the kingdom into 2 pieces, right? You have Israel in the north and Judah in the south. So then, what's after the divided kingdom? Judah alone, right? So they don't stay divided forever. That period lasts for like 200 years, something like that. And then you have Judah alone, right? Assyria comes in and they conquer Israel. And that just leaves Judah for a period. And then eventually, what happens? Judah goes into captivity. Yeah, next period. So Judah goes into captivity, and God wants them to stay there forever, and that's the end of the story, and nothing else happens? No. Yeah, so Babylon comes in, and they take Judah into captivity, but God says you're only going to be in captivity for 70 years. Yeah, and eventually what happens? A remnant returns from captivity. That's right. And so you have waves, 3 waves of exiles returning to Jerusalem under Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah. And then you have what comes after a remnant returns from captivity? Yeah. 400 years of biblical silence, right? And the link is that, in the days of Amos, there's a prophecy that there was going to be a famine and a drought, not for grain or for wheat, but for hearing of the word of God. And that occurs in this time period where there's 400 years until what? The life of Christ. Yeah. So God breaks the 400 years of silence, sending the Messiah. And after the life of Christ, we get the early church, and then letters to the Christians. All right. Any questions about all that? You will be quizzed. Okay. All right, all together now. Everybody speak up. Before the flood, scattering of the people, the patriarchs, exodus from Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, the invasion and conquest of Canaan, the judges, united kingdom, divided kingdom, Judah alone, Judah goes into captivity, a remnant returns from captivity, period of biblical silence for 400 years, the life of Christ, the early church, and letters to the Christians. I know, period of biblical silence for 400 years is a mouthful, but yeah. We're not going to call it the intertestamental period, okay? That's So we talked about before the flood in the last class. Some stories that happened there. Covers Genesis 1 through 5, which is the first 1,600 years of God's creation. There's some stories there that we're pretty familiar with. The 6 days of creation, the first week. There's Adam and Eve in the garden, the first sin, Cain and Abel. And then after these first, like 3 periods, I think, they all kind of close out with a recounting of a genealogy or of generations. You have the period of the flood, Genesis 6 through 10. In this period, we find the flood. Then we have meat given for food, law of capital punishment, covenant of the rainbow, and curse on Canaan, his son. And then, of course, it ends with generations. Now, what's interesting about the flood, if you remember, what did Noah's father say when Noah was born? Really interesting. And people don't really remember this, but I think it's cool. His father said, "This one will give us rest from the toil of our hands." And it's really interesting to think about that as a part of Noah's story, and just try to. A lot of things are happening after the flood, and a lot of promises that God makes and things that God allows after the flood. It's just interesting to think about. Yeah, the scattering of the people, Genesis 10 and 11. We can kind of figure out from chapter 10 that this was maybe 100 years, more or less, after the flood that this takes place. But you have the 3 different families from Noah as they're dispersed, as they're scattered abroad in this period. They built the tower before they were scattered, and then God confused their languages, and then they were scattered. And then, of course, you have the generations that happens after this, but mostly with the descendants of Shem, which brings us to the patriarchs. This is the brunt, or the lion's portion of Genesis, covering Genesis 12 through 50. This time period covers Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then the link here is the story of Joseph, because his brothers see that Joseph is the favorite of Israel, and so they sell him off into slavery. God is with Joseph. And there's a really long story about what happens in Egypt that is really cool. But the bottom line is that Joseph ends up being in a position to be able to help his family during a famine. And so Israel and his family ends up in the Exodus, or ends up in Egypt. This is our review so far. We've gone through pretty much all of this on the last class. Any questions, comments so far? Seems clear? Doing all right? Zoning out just a little bit? That's all right. So the next one is the Exodus. Quiz, just to make sure you guys were listening. How long are they in Egypt before they leave Egypt? Not 70, not 430 years, yes. 430 years is the amount of time that they're in Exodus. What's happening during those 430 years? Yeah, I mean, like, after 430 years, there's a lot of people being born, right? And so Israel multiplies. And then as the story goes on in Exodus 1, what's going on? Who takes leadership in Exodus?
I think too, while they're in Egypt, God separates them because they don't mingle in with the Egyptians. They have their own area.
That's an interesting point. And I don't know whether I thought about that. But Janice is saying that there's probably some divine intervention in the way that Israel is allowed a land in Egypt to live in, and they aren't mixing or mingling with the Egyptians. They seem to remain a distinct people, so they're not assimilated into Egypt, which is interesting. Never thought about that. Paul?
So before that, there's a story of Jacob. The people, whenever they went into a land, let's intermarry and we'll fill the land and get rich together. I believe she's absolutely right. God says, I'm going to stop this so that we can have that pure line to the Messiah.
Right. Yeah. So, 430 years are passing, and Israel is multiplying, and they are remaining a distinct people from the Egyptians. And then something new happens in the Egyptian government, right? What happens? So a new Pharaoh rises, right? And it says a new Pharaoh rose which did not know Joseph. Yeah. Why is that important?
Because the Pharaoh before made Joseph second in command because of the wisdom that he had from God. So he appreciated what God did for Egypt.
So yeah, like you would hope that all the pharaohs before this guy were people who like knew some of the history behind why there's this people living in Egypt. But however, we see this new pharaoh who doesn't know anything about that history. And so to him, he looks inside of his land and he sees Israel, a whole bunch of people, and what's kind of his, why is he freaking out about it? Okay, yeah. The problem with having a whole bunch of people from a different country in your country, from a leader's perspective, is that, well, if there's ever a war, then they're gonna side with the enemies, and then we'll have sleeper cells in our country, right? Get your heads out of the gutter. I'm not saying anything about current politics. We're not going down that rabbit hole. All right. So, what does the Pharaoh decide he's going to do? All right, kill all the male babies. And he tells the Hebrew midwives, right? Shiphrah and Zipporah, I think, or something like that. Is it Zipporah? Not Zipporah. Somebody can fact check me on that. Shiphrah and something. Puah, yes, you're right. Yes, Shiphrah and Puah. And he tells them, when you're helping the Hebrew women to give birth, if it's a boy, you kill the boy. If it's a girl, you let her live. But the train of thought there is that if there's no men to fight and to rebel, then as a nation, we're going to be able to rule over these people, right? More than just wanting to kill the Hebrew boys, though, what else does Pharaoh want to do or start doing to the Hebrews? Yeah, he enslaves them. He forces them to make bricks and do all kinds of slave labor.
He disarms them to be able to do it.
He what?
He disarms them. He takes.
Oh.
They have to come to the Egyptians for their tools and to get anything sharpened or anything like that.
Right. Yeah. So this is, tyranny 101, right? Like this guy's doing his best to keep Israel under his thumb. It seems like he's winning, right? Like it seems like it's all working. And then comes along this guy who's born, and his name's Moses. And the story with him is that he's saved miraculously, even though this tyrannical leader wants to kill all the baby boys, wants to kill him, maybe not personally, but in general. And so his family protects him, his family hides Moses, and then eventually Pharaoh's own daughter ends up drawing Moses out of the water, and he gets to grow up in the Egyptian household. And he, we're told in Acts by Stephen, is learned in the ways of the Egyptians. He's mighty in speech and conduct, is how Moses is described. And he's not going to describe himself that way. We're going to see where he doesn't. But he grows up in the Egyptian household until eventually he sees something. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave, right? And that causes Moses to rise up and kill the Egyptian. So he does, and he hides the Egyptian in the sand. The next day he comes out, and he sees two Hebrews fighting with each other. And then he tells them, "Why do you fight? Aren't you brothers?" How is he greeted? How does his brothers respond?
Like what you did to the Egyptians.
Yeah. They reject him, right? Like outright, they reject him. Yeah, you're not going to kill us like you did the Egyptian, right? Well, later on in Acts, Stephen is going to add some details to this event, right? Do you guys remember what Stephen says Moses was intending by killing that Egyptian slave driver? Yeah. Stephen says that he did it supposing that God was granting deliverance to his people through him. That is what he was thinking. Okay? Whether that means that he really meant to start a full-on exodus right then and there, a revolt, I don't know. It kind of sounds like it. Or whether he just meant to save this guy, and so that's deliverance. But either way, that's interesting. And yet he's rejected by his people. And so he flees into the land of Midian. Or he flees to the wilderness. There he gets married to Zipporah, and that's where that name came from, and why it's jumbled up in there. He marries Zipporah. He has at least one son, right? But he works as a shepherd for his father-in-law. And he's on the mountain of the Lord, Mount Horeb, and he sees what? A burning bush. Burning bush. He sees the burning bush, and he thinks to himself when he sees it, I must turn aside and look at this, right? Because the bush itself is on fire, right? But it's not being burned up. And that's when God starts speaking to him. And what's the first thing that God tells Moses? Yeah, take your sandals off. You're on holy ground, right? So immediately, Moses is not just speaking to, somebody standing behind the bush, right? He's not speaking to some other kind of spirit or something like that. No, this is something that his first interaction, first command from the bush, from God, is one concerning holiness. I think that's interesting. His first interaction with God is a declaration of God's own holiness and a command to behave accordingly. And then God tells Moses to do what? Just generally. Yeah. he tells him to lead his people out of Egypt, and Moses, he agrees with this right off the bat, right? No problems. No. He kind of argues with God, right? Or he puts some objections up. And what does Moses say? Yeah, I ain't good at talking, which is a ridiculous excuse, right? Why is it ridiculous?
Because he's obviously talking right now. I understand his point. It's not always easy to talk to.
Yeah, maybe we sympathize. Yeah, maybe we do.
He was educated in Pharaoh's house.
So, yeah, like for one, we do get confirmation later on that no, he's perfectly fine at talking, right? He was mighty in speech and conduct. But there's another layer to why it's ridiculous, right? It's the one that God brings up. Have I not made you? I made your tongue. I know who you are, and I am telling you to go. And if God did not know that Moses was capable of doing it, would God be asking or telling Moses to do it? No, that's ridiculous. Like, go ahead and tell God that he's making a mistake, why don't you? It's ridiculous. So Moses goes out, and then he does the 10 plagues, or he performs the 10 plagues on Egypt. And the 10 plagues, I've heard that the way that they were all carried out were kind of ironic because of the gods that Egypt worshipped. They considered the Nile River to be kind of a deity or a god because the Nile River provided the Egyptians with life. That was their way of life. But the first plague was, of course, turning the water into blood, right? The entire Nile gets converted into blood. So God is kind of killing the Nile. Pretty cool. And so on and so forth with the 10 plagues. Janice?
First 4 included the entire land, and God shows his separation of his people from the Egyptians, but they don't separate us.
Yeah. Janice is bringing up how the first 4 plagues seem to cover the entire land, and then after that, the following 6 seem to have a distinction, and God seems to spare the Hebrews in the last 6 plagues to make a distinction between the Egyptians and the Hebrews. Good point.
He said he was going to conquer or get honor over the gods of the Egyptians and basically let idolatry. It was take every natural thing or phenomenon and assign it to a god, make up a god in your mind and explain it. So it was very specific what he did.
Yeah. Right. In the end, Pharaoh had his own magicians who attempted to replicate the miracles, and then eventually, I think it's the plague of the gnats that the magicians ended up saying, "This is the finger of God. We can't replicate this," and so yeah. Without question, God proves himself to be God through the 10 plagues. And it's not just about proving the Egyptians' gods as false, right? What does this tell Israel about who God is?
The true God.
Yeah. For one, doesn't it kind of mean that God wants them? I don't know. I know that's a really basic lesson to kind of learn from it, but I think that's a powerful one. And this is going to be something that God refers to again and again and again throughout the rest of these first 5 books of the Bible. God says, remember when I led you out of captivity with signs and wonders. Remember that. It's a declaration of God's power, right? It's a declaration of God's covenant with His people, that He wants them, and He is willing to lead them to be His. Oh, it's powerful. John?
I remember learned history in school, and you learned about how Egypt was this real power in the ancient world. And then after this, the Bible tells us why it changes, and they never ever become the power that they once were. That's why God devastates their land. Think about all these plagues that He sends upon them. I mean, He totally devastates them and brings them low. And then gives that prosperity to people that were bondage. It's with them.
Yeah.
That's pretty bad for them. So it's pretty interesting to see.
Right. John is bringing up the way that God cripples the Egyptians historically, and they just never seem to reach the height of their power after this. Yeah. Eventually, what's the last plague? The what? Death of the firstborn, right? God sends his angel of death to kill the firstborn of everyone in the land, except for those who do what? Yeah. Slaughters the Passover lamb and applies blood onto the lintel and the doorframe of the house. And then God will look on the blood and will pass over the house, and thus we have the feast of the Passover that God then declares His people to celebrate. So Pharaoh's own child dies from this, right? And he's mourning, and Moses comes to him in the middle of Pharaoh's grief, and Pharaoh says, "Get out," right? "Leave. I don't care. Take whatever you want. Go." And so Israel actually leaves Egypt with gold, with silver, with gifts from the Egyptian people, because it's like at this point the Egyptians are paying Israel to leave. They're saying, just take anything you want, just get out. We know what's happening, just leave. And so they, Logan?
I think this is probably one of the most ironic plagues for Pharaoh, because he tried to kill, all the baby boys of those people, and God just takes everyone's firstborn from the livestock, from their families.
Right.
And so, that would definitely make Pharaoh think.
Yeah, it is ironic, considering how all this started with the death of the Hebrew children. Yeah.
God had told him that he would plunder Egypt
Yeah.
because he gave favor. So God made the Egyptians want to give them things.
Yep. God told Israel, told Moses that they will plunder Egypt at the end of all of this. And so, yeah, that's what ends up happening.
Sometimes we forget to realize that there's almost 1 million people that left. And if you consider how many people that is and how long it would take them to let us swallow to go through the Red Sea. I mean, that's daunting for 1 million people taking everything they plundered.
Right. Yeah. And they didn't just keep this all for themselves, all this Egyptian plunder. They kept a lot of it, sure. But later on down the line, what is this plunder going to be used for?
Ultimately turned into an idol, and then eaten by the people.
So there was that. There was the golden calf. That happened. That was not intentional by God, right? He didn't want them to do that. Yeah, the gold is eventually going to be used to build the tabernacle. And so God was using the plunder from these Egyptian pagans in order to help build up his meeting house, right? And I think that's interesting because that kind of like, maybe it sparks something in your mind where you're like, wait a minute, what about the church being the house of God and about all nations coming to him and building up his meeting house today? I don't know. It's cool. But before that, Paul.
Yeah, that was about him being able to have a presence among them.
Right.
Among his people.
Right. Yeah. On the way out of Egypt, though, we back up a little bit. We're the crossing of the Red Sea, so they're about to leave Egypt for good, and they're led to the shore of the Red Sea. Israel comes to the shore of the Red Sea, and looking out, wow, that's a lot of water. But then they look behind them, and they see the Egyptian army, yeah. And they go to Moses, and they're like, you did this on purpose. You wanted us to die, and God wanted to, I don't know. And they say, were there not graves in Egypt that you took us out in the wilderness to be killed? And Moses' response is be quiet. Stay silent while God fights for you, right? And God tells Moses to strike the waters and lift up his staff, and the Red Sea will be parted. And so it does, and they cross it. But what if I'm not ready? Then they go to Sinai. All along the way, they're complaining, right? They complain about water, like right after they got delivered through the Red Sea. Then they complain about not having food. And they get to Sinai, and then God gives them the law. And then they also build the calf, which we talked about. And they also built the tabernacle at Sinai, and that's the way that Exodus ends. It's talking about the tabernacle. And then they come to Kadesh Barnea, and that is where they send in the 10 spies, the 12 spies. The 10 spies come back with a bad news, right? They say, we're not able to take the land. But there's the 2 spies, Caleb and Joshua, who come back saying, yeah, we could do it. The people listen to the voice of the 10 spies, and they are too afraid to go into Canaan land. And because of that, God calls them to wander in the wilderness. Yeah. So the people are wandering in the wilderness. And these events are covered in Numbers and parts of Deuteronomy, in the first couple chapters of Joshua. Maybe I should save this for next time. We'll go through part of it. So Israel is sentenced to wander in the wilderness, right? How many years?
1 year for every day they were in the spy.
Yeah, one year for every day that the spies were in the land, right? 40 years until that whole generation that didn't trust in God died out. Stories that we have in this portion of history is Korah, Dathan, and Abiram, who end up rebelling and kind of saying, why has God chosen Moses to lead? Or why has God chosen Aaron? I think more of their problem was with Aaron. But God proves himself. He causes Aaron's rod to come back to life. Miriam dies, and then quickly following that, you have the sin of Moses and Aaron as they strike the rock instead of speaking to it like God commands them. And then right after that, Aaron dies. Pretty eventful chapter. In Deuteronomy, we're told about passing by Edom. Israel had to go around or kind of tiptoe through Edom a little bit. And so that's Wandering in the Wilderness Part 1, because the next slide is Part 2. But we'll get to that later. But before we close up here, You know what we got to do. Put your Bibles away. Come on. All right. Yeah, the first period is before the flood. The flood, the scattering of the people, the patriarchs, Exodus from Egypt, wandering in the wilderness, the invasion and conquest of Canaan, the judges, united kingdom, divided kingdom, Judah alone, Judah goes into captivity, a remnant returns from captivity, period of biblical silence for 400 years. Life of Christ, early church, and letters to the Christians. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. I appreciate you sticking in there. And that will be it.